Thank you, Dr. Federley, for that hauntingly beautiful piece of music as we begin our service today. Thank you, Brooks, and thank you, Mignon, for beginning our service so warmly as well. I'd like to share with you a reading for our chalice lighting that comes from the Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg. She writes, "Vulnerability in the face of constant change is what we share, whatever our present condition." And so, in honor of one more thing which unites us, namely our vulnerability, we light this chalice flame. As our opening words, I'd like to share with you some words written by a colleague, Dana Worsnop, who wrote a piece called "I Want to Be with People." Often people say, she wrote, that they love coming to a place with so many like-minded people. I know what they are getting at, but I really don't want to be with a group of people who think just like me. I want to be in a community where I don't have to think like everyone else to be loved, to be eligible for whatever they describe as salvation. I want to be with people who value compassion, justice, love, and truth, though they have different thoughts and opinions about all sorts of things. I want to be with independent-minded people of good heart. I want to be with people who have many names or no name at all for God. I want to be with people who see in me goodness and integrity, who also see my foibles and my failings and who still love me. I want to be with people who feel their inner connection with all existence and let it guide their footfalls upon this precious earth. I want to be with people who see life as a paradox and are not in a hurry to solve it. I want to be with people who are willing to walk the tight rope that is life and who will hold my hand as I walk mine. I want to be with people who let church or a fellowship call them into a different way of being in the world. I want to be with people who support, encourage, and even challenge one another to a higher and more ethical way of living. I want to be with people who covenant to be honest, engaged, and kind, who strive to keep their promises and hold me to the promises I make them. I want to be with people who give of themselves, who share their hearts and their minds and their gifts. I want to be with people who know that human community is often warm and generous, sometimes challenging, and almost always a great and grand adventure. In short, I want to be with people like you. May we go to the next part of our program. To read the covenant, that was very beautiful and moving to me to see all those different faces reading something that this congregation holds in common. And thank you, Pam, for your wonderful and beautiful story. And for the props you brought into that were pretty amazing, I must say. Thank you for that. And choir, what can I say? You're amazing squared. I just had this feeling, wow, I wish that could be broadcasted on all social media of the fellowship. It was just so visually powerful and so wonderfully done. Thank you. I'd like to tell you a story today about a congregation that was saved by a covenant. It was one of those powerful experiences in my life that formed how I understand covenants and why I believe they are important. And this story comes from a group of people belonging to a church that was not part of our denomination. It was a liberal Protestant denomination that the church was a part of. And they have a polity that is very similar to our own. And ideologically and in terms of beliefs, they would probably be quite similar to the average UU congregation. Certain details are altered to ensure anonymity. A minister had a son who was very active in the youth program. He was in high school. On the last Sunday of the year, the Sunday after Christmas, the Sunday that has the lowest level of energy and involvement by the congregation, the minister allowed and encouraged his son to take the lead in a youth-led worship service. This was not untypical. The youth did one or two services their own during the course of the year. This was an easy time for them to do something because the energy in the congregation was generally so low. The minister's son recruited about 4 or 5 friends. They did a good service. People were very appreciative. It was a small group assembled there, but they really liked what the minister's son and his friends had done. Over the next 3 weeks, the minister's son concocted an idea about being involved in social activism in the community using the youth group. And he did this really collaboratively with the other youth who were fired up and excited about this possibility. Most of the adult youth leaders, there were 4 adults assigned to this youth group to lead it for the congregation, were out of town. And so at the next meeting, the minister's son introduced this idea. There were about 15 teenagers there. There was 1 or 2 adults present who weren't part of the formal leadership structure. And the proposal of the minister's son was affirmed strongly. People were excited about it. 3 weeks later, rumors began to circulate, emanating from the adult youth leaders, that the minister's son was trying to take authority away from the adult leaders of the youth group. The 4 adult youth leaders began to complain to anyone who would listen to them. The turmoil of this brought those 4 adult leaders closer together. They had worked together about 1.5 years, but they became closer. And in one of these meetings where they were talking and commiserating with one another, one of them shared that his wife had been in a struggle with breast cancer for 9 months. They began, this group of adults, to talk about the minister's son being used as a proxy for expanding the power and authority of the minister. And they were unhappy with that and saw it as a larger pattern. One of the group in the 4 adult youth leaders had been a close friend of the minister before the current minister, and that person had been at work in the congregation for 17 years. As the minister began to hear gossip about the youth leader's disgruntlement, he began to talk among people he knew in the congregation well about how these adult youth leaders were a problem. and had perhaps, he suggested, not helped them in their spiritual development. One person, sympathetic to the minister, suggested that certain people had really never let go of the minister who had been there 17 years, although he had been gone for at least 4 years by now. The minister stopped speaking to the adults of the youth leaders, and the youth leaders stopped speaking to the minister. The leaders of the youth group began to compile a list of what they called inappropriate actions and decisions going back 3 years that the minister had made. They showed this list to anyone who might be sympathetic. After a routine physical, the minister's doctor thought it necessary to increase the blood pressure medication the minister was on. One of the youth group leaders, without consulting anyone, called the minister, the former minister, who then suggested that this person call a denominational leader and try to seek some help. And when that person did seek a consultant at the national level of the denomination, the consultant told him there could be a problem there. The individual reported back to his group that the consultant had said, there is a problem at the church and it needs to be solved and solved soon. In late April, the minister asked someone from the national headquarters to come and help them. The board refused to do so because to do so would, some of them said, be embarrassing. Starting in late April, one of the offended group leaders began to sit in the center aisle, right next to the center aisle, on the 4th row from the front, and knit during the entire service, never looked at the minister, but scowled occasionally at what he said. It took 7 weeks for everybody in the entire congregation to be aware that something was going on. It was though everyone who was affected by anyone who was passionate about this subject was swept into an irreversible force of persuasion, where they had to take one side or the other. In June, a new chair of the board took office. This person was deeply influenced by a close friend who was an attorney and had done legal work with couples who were looking for a divorce for about 10 years, and she specialized in what was called no-fault divorce. In other words, she created negotiations for people who were thinking of breaking up their marriage. And under the guidance of this individual, the board president sent out a letter to everybody in the congregation, which read in part as follows. This problem will not be solved when people begin to speak to one another directly about whatever is bothering them and stop speaking to other people about other people. If we all begin to take responsibility for our part of the problem and stop trying to bring the other person around to our version of perfection, things will move towards resolution. Then the same letter stated that there would be a meeting for everyone, convened by the board president and the board, who wanted to discuss this issue. And they could say anything they wanted to, but there were 3 rules that would govern the discussion. And those 3 rules were as follows. We will not talk negatively about or attack other people. Number 2, We will focus on the future and solutions and not the past and injuries we believe we have suffered from others in the past. Number 3, we will state our views always in the framework of this is my personal opinion only. The board president then got on the phone and called every single adult youth leader and every ally of the minister and every ally of the youth leaders, anybody who she knew was involved emotionally, and requested that they come to this meeting. Then she opened up the entire meeting to anybody in the congregation who wanted to attend in addition. Everyone who was involved or had been involved in this problem attended that meeting. There was a lot of tension in the air. Some people were so nervous that they would dart out of the room, go to the restroom, go get a drink of water, and there were a couple of people who actually left, went out to the parking lot that could be seen from this room people were in, and smoked some cigarettes and then come back in, but nobody left for good. And the fact that everybody could be in the same room together and discuss an emotional subject lowered the anxiety. Each moment the meeting carried on. The meeting began with a recitation by the president of the meeting guidelines, the 3 things I mentioned before. The board president then asked one person from each side to express the problem as they saw it. The board president repeatedly stated the rules that she had given at the beginning of the meeting. If the rules were broken, she said, she would interject, and she did on a number of occasions. She also said something that turned out to be a very important statement to make. She said, "We are not here today to resolve any issues, but to hear ideas." In other words, there was no pressure to get anything done. It was an opportunity for people to talk. Then they went through the process. Each side had 3 opportunities to speak. Then at the end of that, the board president said, well, I am now going to meet with 2 members of each side of this issue. We are going to meet over a month period as often as we need to, and we are going to clarify the relationship of the authority of the minister, the authority of the adult leaders of this group, and the function and role of this youth group. We're going to discuss, in other words, and clarify their relationship. This process was repeated 3 times. The board president read the rules. She announced the conclusions that they had come to from the prior meeting. They went through the process, and then at the end of it, the board president said, okay, now for the next month, we are going to focus on this issue, and I'm inviting these people to be a part of it. And they did that. By the time they got to the 4th meeting, no one had anything else to say. Note that this process involved the facilitation of each side speaking their point of view and being heard by the other side without the other side interacting, and being heard by everyone who was interested in coming. No one from the outside or the inside said, I have the solution to your problem. No one said, I am an expert and I have an expert opinion, listen to me. That never occurred. No one said, I have the definitive idea about how this should be resolved. All of that was put aside, and they engaged in a process of dialogue. 6 months after they began this process, the situation was totally changed. The minister's son decided that he was going to devote his energy to activities at his high school and not his church. The minister decided that he was going to become engaged more in social activism and be less involved in things within the church itself. One of the adult youth group leaders resigned from the group and said that he was going to devote his time to taking care of his wife. One of the adult leaders decided to be involved in some other activity in the church. 2 of the adult leaders decided that they would continue this work, but they said they had learned a great deal from the process. I wish to stress something. The problems were not solved by anyone telling anyone else what they should do. The system itself created the solutions. The solutions, when they started, were in some ways surprising but effective. And it was a simple covenant, that 3-rule covenant, which brought about and enabled this process to occur, which led to resolution. It was quite remarkable because people who had been passionately upset and angry experienced all of that just dissolving and becoming irrelevant as the process allowed something to happen. At the height of this conflict, impending disaster would have been the only solution. The minister stayed at that congregation productively and happily for 12 more years. Covenants are an essential feature of all healthy congregations. That is why I'm deeply appreciative and thankful for the Committee on Ministries' visionary leadership in trying to help guide this congregation through the process of articulating what is already on the hearts and minds of everyone, but which can now come out and be clarified and be something everyone affirms. I look forward to having a dialogue with this congregation or anyone who's interested after the service, for those who are interested. Amen. I share with you these words from the great late Black writer James Baldwin for the extinguishing of our chalice. He writes, "I would like us to do something unprecedented, to create ourselves without finding it necessary to create an enemy to do so." And I share these words of benediction with you from a colleague, Tom Shade. And after the service, I look forward to talking with anyone who is interested in discussing my sermon today further. But these words from Tom are entitled "The Power at Work in the Universe." My friends, there is a power at work in the universe. It is creative, sustaining, and transforming. We can trust that power with our lives. It will sustain us whenever we take a stand on the side of love, whenever we take a stand for peace and justice, whenever we take a risk for just cause. we are together and individually held by that power. May we trust each and all together in that great power. Amen.